Hello, I am Alex Gilvarry, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2022 Brooklyn Book Festival's virtual festival day for a conversation with Antoine Wilson, Yiyun Li, and Sarah Manguso. The subject of our panel today is what is real? I feel like that should be like, what is real, dude? Punctuated by something stoner-ish. Before we begin, I want to let everybody know that books by the authors in this program can be purchased in the link below, and I'll remind everybody how to do that at the end. So just some brief intros. Antoine Wilson is the author of 3 novels, the most recent of which is Mouth to Mouth. Yiyun Li is the author of 10 books, the latest of which is the Book of Goose. And Sarah Manguso is the author of 7 previous books. Her most recent is the novel Very Cold People. Welcome, everybody. It's great to talk to you and moderate this panel.
Thank you.
So, what is real? I thought there's a quote from Yiyun's latest novel, The Book of Goose. I thought it was appropriate to sort of begin with it and it's that the quote is, all worlds, fabricated or not, are equally real. The latter half of that quote is, and so they are equally unreal, but I think we can unpack that, a little later. I wanted to start with fabricated or not are equally real. I wanted to discuss and ask you guys, what is reality or realness to you in literature, and therefore, how do you think about it in your novels? Is it real life you're trying to capture on the page? Is it something different than that, or adjacent to real life? Why don't we begin with Yiyun?
Oh, all right. Yeah. So all world fabricated or not are equally real. I tend to think about, I think fiction more than real life is, I think about 2 things when I write fiction. One is time, one is physical setting. So space, time and space. I mean, I think unless something extraordinary happens in fiction, I have written 1 novel that does not have a physical setting, so there's no space, but most of the novels do have physical setting, and I think physical setting is part of reality to me. But on the other hand, the temporal setting, time is much more fluid, and I think much of reality and unreality and the slope between has something to do with time. So I think, well, I would call myself a realistic author, so novelist. So maybe I do think about physical space and time as, part of that equation where which part is real, which part is unreal. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. And do you, does that, and that seems to just, does that make you believe in the world when you're kind of writing it? It situates you there?
I never really think about the real world. I think the real world is here in my head. So it feels real, but it doesn't have to be real like, the outside world. Yes.
Yeah. Let's go to Sarah.
Oh, sure. Thank you. As the novice fiction writer on this panel, I'm really tempted to try to talk about the difference between reality in autobiographical nonfiction, which is my much more familiar mode, as compared with the reality in the 1 novel I've written so far. And I'm really tempted to say that you you have to have more conscious control over the reality that you construct in fiction, because you get to make more choices about it. You get to choose whether the narrator is reliable. You get to choose, really everything about it. Yiyun's quote about how things are equally real and unreal is, it's true in I think a more limited way if you're writing autobiographical nonfiction. And when I write autobiographically, I don't get to choose my degree of reliability because I am only myself. That decision just isn't available to me. And the freedom from needing to make that decision, I think, is one reason that autobiography can be so much easier than fiction, because there's just this entire category of decision-making that can be sidestepped. So as I see it, writing this novel kind of gathered onto my desk all of these decisions that I hadn't had to consider before. And so it really feels as if I'm sort of graduating into a more complex way of thinking about storytelling.
Right. Yeah. You're not thinking about realness when you're writing autobiographical or
Yeah.
up there.
Yeah. It's just there. I don't have to acknowledge it. I don't have to create it. I don't have to change it. All I have to do is perceive it. And,
Right.
And to do so wholly or partially or right or wrong. I just kind of, I'm the only one there, as it were.
Yeah. How about you, Antoine?
Well, I just wanted to respond to something that Sarah said, which is she finds fiction more difficult. I find nonfiction way more difficult, and I find the decisions that you have to make in nonfiction to be way more challenging than the ones that I make in fiction. But maybe it's a matter of sort of temperament or practice. With nonfiction, I struggle with the quote unquote real reality that I'm trying to reflect on the page, and I feel I'm not a great liar like in life, and I don't tend to I try to be an honest person in general, or I just am by nature. And as I rub my, is that a tell right there?
That is a tell. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh shit. In any case, I find it very hard to write nonfiction because I feel like I'm lying the entire time, because I'm unable to sort of reflect reality on the page adequately to what existed. And so for me, when I think about reality in fiction, I think about time and space, like Yiyun said, but also language, and with not only the sort of language that the reader is taking in and creating their own, reality with the book, but also within the book, within my books, there's a lot of there are a lot of questions about reliability of our own ability to like account for ourselves in language. So it feels like language, to me, language can be entirely sincere and also be, never hitting the mark.
Yeah, that's very evident, I think, what you just said in mouth to mouth. Just a quick follow-up on, for Antoine and Yiyun, you mentioned time and space, and I was just wondering about, we talked about space. I was just wondering about time. Are you talking about like the era of your story, or the timeline, the span of time that things are going to happen?
Right. I often think time, we do, in the Newtonian world, time is a linear thing, but in fiction and in our how we feel about things, time is not linear. And I feel like I include myself in this. I think many people and most characters live in multiple moments at any given moment in fiction or in life. And so the decisions or, the actions, oftentimes they're just it's like I play the accordion. It's just you collapse the accordion into one, moment. So it's multiple time points in that timeline, collapse into one moment. And that's how I look at time. It's not quite, era, the setting of the, post-World War II, but more it's just a time in how a person feels about his or her life.
Right.
Yeah, same. And I like linearity as a backbone or a train track or something to return to, because I think we're always living in that as well. And, the way that we read is going to be linear no matter what. But one writer who I've just been loving, who just passed away on September 11th, is Javier Marias. And one of the most remarkable things about his work, especially when I first started reading it, the first book I think I read was Tomorrow in the Battle, Think on Me, is he has no problem just usually there's a scene going on, and he has no problem just stopping everything to do what Yiyun is talking about, that sort of multi-layered, all of the things that are coming to mind. So in somebody's more minimalist work where you'd have like lines of dialogue, just boom, 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 the talking heads, that may be 60 pages in Your Face Tomorrow with all kinds of considerations in between. So I love writers who play with time that way, as long as they're not boring.
Sarah, I'm interested, coming from, a very accomplished nonfiction background, was time something that you was new to contend with in the story as well?
That's interesting. It didn't feel as functionally different as the decision about how much my protagonist would know, or how correctly my protagonist would interpret things. I've always had a difficult time experiencing my life linearly. What Ian just said about inhabiting multiple moments simultaneously at all times, it is a really apt description of how I feel. And it's an apt description of how my protagonist Ruthie feels in Very Cold People. There always is this simultaneity, and it seems, sort of more real, or it seems extremely important to try to communicate the experience of inhabiting time that way, because that's what feels more real than just sort of like, going down the track slowly, having, events accumulate. And I guess that brings the role of memory into things. But as an autobiographical person, that's always been one of my central foci. But time is managing time, telling a linear story was just as difficult in this novel as it always has been in writing about my own life, which is to say almost impossible.
Great. I want to hear so badly you guys read some passages from your new novels. Yiyun, should we start with you and we'll just go in the same order?
Okay, yes. Okay, so I'm just going to read from the beginning, just a couple very short excerpts. You cannot cut an apple with an apple. You cannot cut an orange with an orange. You can, if you have a knife, cut an apple or an orange, or slice open the underbelly of a fish. Or if your hands are steady enough and the blade is sharp enough, sever an umbilical cord. You can slash a book. There are different ways to measure depth, but not many readers measure a book's depth with a knife, making a cut from the first page all the way down to the last. Why not, I wonder? You can hand the knife to another person, betting with yourself how deep a wound he or she is willing to inflict. You can be the inflictor of the wound. One half orange plus another half orange do not make a full orange again. And that is where my story begins. An orange that did not think itself good enough for a knife. and an orange that never dreamed of turning itself into a knife. Cut and be cut. Neither interested me back then. My name is Agnes, but that is not important. You can go into an orchard with a list of names and write them on the oranges, Francoise and Pierre and Diane and Louise. But what difference does it make? What matters to an orange is its orangeness. The same with me. My name could have been Clementine or Odette or Henrietta, but so? An orange is just an orange, as a doll is a doll. Don't think that once you name a doll, it is different from other dolls. You can bathe it and clothe it and feed it empty air and put it to bed with the lullabies you imagine a mother should be singing to a baby. All the same, the doll, like all dolls, cannot even be called dead, as it was never alive. The name you should pay attention to in this story is Fabienne. Fabienne is not an orange or a knife or a singer of lullabies, but she can make herself into any one of those things. Well, she once could. She's dead now. The news of her death arrived in a letter from my mother, the last of my family still living in Saint-Remy. Though my mother was not writing particularly to report the death, but the birth of her own first great-grandchild. Had I remained near her, she would have questioned why I have not given birth to a baby to be added to her collection of grandchildren. This is a good thing about living in America. I am too far away to be her concern. But long before my marriage, I stopped being her concern. My fame took care of that. America and fame, they are equally useful if you want freedom from your mother. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Yiyun. That was wonderful. Let's go to Sarah.
Sure. I loved listening to that, Ian. I'm just going to read from the beginning of the book. My parents didn't belong in Waitsfield, but they moved there anyway. My mother answered the first knock at the door of the new house, expecting a casserole. We'd painted the house evening fog, she told me, but the woman from across the street wanted to know why we'd painted it purple like Italians. Some people wore their difference honestly, but my parents were liars, illegitimate Waitsfielders, their off-whiteness discovered only after the paint had dried. By the time I was born, the house had faded to the color of dirty snow. The oldest houses in Waitsfield were older than the town and bore plaques to mark their age. Generations of families had been born and died in them, and the town's 6 graveyards were populated mostly by children. Over the centuries, the slate stones had eroded and sunk in the dirt, and they looked like gray, crooked teeth inscribed with little lambs and angels. On the way to school, I walked past a 300-year-old mustard yellow salt box that my mother admired for its leaded glass windows and historically correct paint color. It probably had all the right antique fixtures inside, big sooty hearths and Indian shutters, visible proof of connection to the first best people. My mother referred to Western Massachusetts as out west, and I was mostly ignorant of the geography beyond our neighborhood. 3/4 of the town stayed unknown to me, and that mystery drummed up a sense of scale. To this day, I couldn't tell you how to get to the lodge school where the rich kids went. It was just there, somewhere in those 10 square miles, not for me to find. When I walked home from school, I picked up leaves that were gold-specked crimson, green-edged vermilion, purple black. I picked everything up, pebbles and matchbooks and little things people dropped. In December, I picked up evergreen branches and taped them to my bedroom door and made decorations, a little Christmas garland just for me. One day, my mother emptied my jacket pockets and found 2 half-used matchbooks and screamed at me. I could have started a fire, but I wouldn't have wasted a match to start a mere fire. I'd found what someone else had thought was trash, so I took it. 1 inch of rain equals 10 inches of snow, we all knew, but that had to be approximate since there were so many different combinations of snow and ground. I remember the metallic smell of it in the air before it fell, the pale blue of it on a clear morning, the soft thuh of it falling, the powder of the coldest days, too cold to melt, squeaking at the boot, white, wet snow squeaking against my teeth, melting clear in the heat of my mouth. Snowfalls have unique bouquets. Snow isn't just frozen water, it carries a remnant of the sky. A blue hailstone tastes different from a white one because they've taken on air at different altitudes. We ate icicles not because they tasted good, but because they were a primal thing that could not be bought. To eat one was to dare someone to tell you it wasn't clean, that there was dirt in it, which we all knew. Everyone eats a peck of dirt in their life.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. Great reading. Let's go to Antoine.
Can we just listen to Sarah and Yiyun read all day?
Sure.
Yeah. Wow.
Just pass your novel. I'll read for you.
No, we want your stuff. All right, I'll just read from the beginning of mine as well. I sat at the gate at JFK, having red-eyed my way from Los Angeles, exhausted, minding my own business, reflecting on what I'd seen the night before, shortly after takeoff, shortly before sleep, something I'd never seen before from an airplane. I'd been on the left side of the plane, and we'd gone south over the ocean, accident of fate, affording me a panoramic view of the city at night, amber streetlights dotting neighborhoods, red stripe, white stripe garlands of freeway traffic, mysterious black gaps of waterways and parkland. Then a small burst of light, not at ground level, but above it. Another burst of light, streaks opening like a flower in time lapse. A fireworks show. I watched the little explosions until we penetrated the cloud layer. It wasn't a holiday. I was thinking about how a sight that might consume our attention completely on the ground could, from another perspective, barely register as a blip on an enormous field when I heard a name over the PA. Jeff Cook, the agent said, please check in at the counter for gate 11. A common enough name, but it piqued my attention. I had known a Jeff Cook once at UCLA, almost 20 years earlier. Looking up, I saw a handsome man in his 40s striding toward the counter. He was dressed in a sharp blue suit, no tie, glasses with transparent lucite frames, expensive leather loafers. He said his name to the gate agent and slid his boarding pass and identification across the counter. While she clicked away at the noisy keyboard, he leaned slightly on the handle of his fancy, hard-shelled rollaboard suitcase. From where I sat near the gate, I could examine this Jeff Cook closely in profile. I had all but determined that he wasn't the Jeff Cook I'd known and was going to turn my attention elsewhere when he looked in my direction. I knew those high, broad cheekbones and that penetrating gaze. It was he. But Jeff had had famously long, dark, flowing hair, not this cropped salt and pepper business. Plus, he'd put on weight, become more solid in the way so many of us did after college, continuing to grow into manhood long after we thought we'd arrived. We hadn't been friends exactly, barely acquaintances, but Jeff was one of those minor players from the past who claimed for himself an outsized role in my memories. During my freshman year, I experienced a series of encounters, if they could even be called that, in various locations on and off campus with a fellow student who had, for some reason or another, caught my attention. With his cascading hair and distinctive features, he was hard to miss, a sort of thrift store Adonis, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of an upperclassman. We didn't cross paths so much as he would just pop up from time to time, at a table in the corner of a coffee shop, wandering around a protest for the first Gulf War, or, most randomly, lit up by my car's reverse lights as I backed out of a friend's driveway one night. Every sighting of this mystery man yielded a frisson, as if he were my guardian angel keeping tabs on me, followed by a pang of anxiety at the thought that I might never see him again. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Antoine. Wonderful. I was reminded while you guys were reading, just how easy it was for me to fall into, these books, the reality of them, these worlds. It has something to do with your craft of a narration. I sometimes think like the great books are those when we're reading, we kind of forget we're reading them, and we just enter that space of the imaginative reader, and the narrator is there but not there. Some would think that like the easiest way to achieve this would be make the reader less aware of the narrator, like third person, less distracting. You just fall into the world, and kind of imagine it. But in all of your books, we are being told the story by someone, and I think we're quite aware of them. Yet you were also able to achieve this thing of me just falling into the story and kind of imagining it. So it's what I call kind of the sweet spot where I forget I forget I'm reading, and then I'm being told a story. My question is, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on this, and how did you approach how your books would be told? Antoine, yours is very different in a way. The narrator who you just read from his voice, most of the novel is told by this guy Jeff Cook, who he meets, and that's where the story is. Yiyun and Sarah's, I think your books are more similar. In Yiyun's book, there is an element of like Fabienne telling stories to Agnes. So I'm just curious, how did you approach how your books would be told? Antoine, could we start with you?
Sure. I have to say, it's, for a fairly short book, it was a long and torturous process. I was abandoning this book for another book, and then back and forth for some time. And one of the issues I had with this book, the sort of initial version of it, or the beginning version of it, which was 1.5 times longer than the final book, was a first person narrative from Jeff's point of view. So I was still discovering the book and discovering what Jeff's story was. And I kept sort of hitting the rocks, I couldn't figure out why it wasn't working for me. And part of the issue was that I felt like Jeff's voice was sort of right front and center too much. And that sort of idea that his voice was going straight into the reader to be judged as reliable or not, I don't know, there was something about it where I felt like it needed to be mediated. So that's where I came upon the idea of having sort of an interlocutor, an anonymous, a nameless narrator in between, which then resulted in this kind of filmic cutting away. Jeff tells a little bit of his story, and then it cuts away into a close third person. And it's an unreliable close third person, I guess. So I narrative complexity like that interests me, in addition to, whatever the content is of the book. So that's when I first sort of intuitively felt, yeah, this works. Like I can keep writing this book. So it was the key for me. I don't know why exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the story came first, and then the way it was told, you kind of discovered in your process.
Yeah, the story up into the rescue and a little bit beyond that. Then it grew once I had the other pieces in place. Yeah.
Sarah?
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear that Antoine's writing process was torturous, because this book of his is, it's one of these books that just flows so effortlessly into the reader. Of course, you never know what the author was thinking at any one moment during the process, but yeah, no, it's great. It's great to know that there was so much suffering that went into it. I'm sorry. So when writing my novel, I began with what turns out to be a frame story, a very brief frame story that occupies 2 chapters in the middle of the book now, about a character named Winifred Cabot Fish. And I originally thought, while the working title for the novel was Winifred, I originally thought that it would just sort of be this period piece about a woman living in New England, traversing this unbreakable barrier between social classes, and either committing or witnessing a murder. And I thought I had all of the ingredients that I needed for a really substantial, long novel. And, my writing style being what it is, I wrote it all in about 15 pages. And then I got incredibly bored, and I didn't want to do anything else with Winifred. And it wasn't for another year or two working on this other book about it was sort of a coming of age story taking place many decades later. I thought, oh, well, Winifred is relevant because or Winifred was boring because she wasn't real. And then when I realized that Ruthie could just, Winifred could just be somebody that Ruthie imagines, things started to come together. And so that was one of the main breakthroughs, I think, in thinking about this novel. And I was very surprised that there is sort of this island of imagination within the, more or less linear story.
Great. You?
Yeah, I so love listening to both of you talk about the process. And partly, I think once the book is done, we forget how miserable we went, how miserably we went through the process. So my first person, I'm not by nature a first person narrator. I mostly, especially my short fiction, they're all written in third person. So, but I think sometimes, just the characters decide how they want their stories to be told. Agnes is so close to her story. I knew right away it could not be a third person story. The story itself did not stand that kind of distance. So I did start with first person, Agnes telling the story. But I love listening to Sarah and Antoine's process, because at some point I actually inserted a frame, even though the frame is not there anymore. I inserted a frame, I think, because I wasn't entirely comfortable with such a close distance to the first person narrator. So I framed with a second narrator, also first person narrator, describing, his meeting with Agnes 50 years later. And clearly it was all psychological comfort for myself rather than for the book. And clearly every early reader said, why is this man here? He's irrelevant to the story. I think, sometimes we writers do things sort of to comfort ourselves, or to make ourselves a little bit more comfortable with discomfort. For me, it's the first person narrator. So I did get rid of the frame, and clearly the frame didn't even need to be there.
It sounds like all of you. Oh, go ahead, Antoine.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's so interesting you talk about the character being so close that you felt it necessitated first person. And I've just determined recently, I'm like, okay, my process, I guess, is that I need to have first person. And then once I get that going, I can do what I want with it. As soon as I declared that, the opposite happened. And the new thing I'm working on is third person. Sure. And I feel like the reason is because I feel like third person gets you closer to the character, because you can kind of, narrate their thoughts, and you can get like in the flow of their thoughts without their speaking language or, their narrating language getting in the way.
Right.
But I mean,
I
it
know.
depends on preference, right?
Yeah, preference also, like I totally get what you're saying. It's, when you're writing in third person, you have a little bit of the godlike, gesture there. You can move very close to, right?
Yeah.
And I think maybe with Goose, Agnes is the kind of character who refuses to be, even be approached by this godlike voice. I usually feel comfortable with that. But I like when you said, the moment you decided it's a first person narrator, it's becoming third person.
Yeah.
I think
You can't declare anything about process without the opposite, coming up and haunting you.
Yeah, that's I was going to jump in and say that if you didn't. But yes, no, every decision that you make before you execute is going to be wrong.
Yeah.
It sounds like stay open, don't declare anything at the beginning of a work, and it sounds like all of you listen to your stories or what's happening, or listen to your characters and what they want to do, or what they want to say. Something that struck me just now while you guys were talking, one of the things I see that's common about your novels, and something that I've always really loved in novels, and I think for me, I discovered it when I first read Murakami, and I read like the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, and I loved how he would let his characters, or like sometimes the secondary characters, so it's first person, and some of the secondary characters, they tell these long stories. He allowed the other characters to tell stories within the books, and I really appreciated that all of your characters in your books tell stories. Sometimes not super long, but they have a story in them. Sarah, in yours, Ruthie tells the story of Winifred. It was so interesting hearing how you came to that, how you came to structure that and reveal it. Yiyun, it's in yours with the two young girls, Agnes and Fabienne, yeah. And they concoct a book together. And then Antoine, of course, it's kind of a big chunk of your novel listening to one of the other characters tell stories. Do you think about this at all when you're I mean, it's something I think about, but I wonder if you think about it at all, is like when you have other characters in a book, or your own characters, do they tell different stories, to you? Do you allow them to take up some of the page with something else that might not be right on plot or something?
I delight in letting other characters sort of take the mic, and I love books that do that. And I don't know why, but it just pleases me. There's a Thomas Bernhard book, Gargoyles, I think it was, and the first chunk of it is this guy the narrator going around with his father, who's a doctor, through, his rounds in the countryside. And then the second half of it is just this one patient, this prince. And the prince goes and just takes over the whole narrative, tells his story. And then the prince tells a story about a dream he had, and something that his child is writing in the dream he had. And then he's got the text of the thing, and it can obviously come off as gimmicky, but in that book, at least, it is both hilarious, and it increases the intensity of the experience. So I also think it gives, if you can give a character the ability to imagine something, you've immediately sort of given that character depth through the illusion of agency and imagination.
Yeah.
I don't know that.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't know that I can speak to this with any degree of authority, having written a total of one novel. But as you were describing this reading experience of being taken almost one level down, deeper into the ground of the story, in which a a character tells a story that isn't the actual story, I immediately thought of Rachel Cusk's Outline trilogy, which is made entirely of stories that don't involve the narrator, and in which the narrator is just sort of there as this pole around which the stories are spun. I absolutely, those books thrilled me, not just because they were so absorbing, but because it offered up a form that I had never considered before as anything that could be, interesting. It sounds so academic even now when I'm trying to describe it, but I assume we're all at least a little familiar with them. They're just absolutely brilliant.
Yes, yeah, I agree with what Sarah and Antoine said. I just want to add, sometimes it's, not even just characters telling stories. It's, the characters do something, thinking themselves unnoticed, but the narrator or the writer has noticed it. I want to use this example because I just love it. And I was rereading Madame Bovary, and there was one sentence about this one little girl, 15-year-old. She was from countryside, and she was apprenticing to become a maid for Emma. I think that novel's attention, much of the attention is with Emma, but then all of a sudden there's a moment about this little girl. Her joy is every night before she goes to bed, she steals a handful of sugar from the cupboard, and then she lies in bed and she licks her, the palm of her hand and eats the sugar. And I feel, that's the kind of attention shift from Emma to the maid. It only happens that once. It only happens, within 15 seconds. But that's, I think partly, because attention catches unprepared, catches the reader unprepared. So we are with the narrator and we are with the little girl. So I like to think, when a narrator, when a character tells a story or does something, sort of divert our attention from the main plot. I hate that word plot, but the main thing. I think it's always, those characters want to tell a story.
Yeah. Oh, and what a fabulous detail. It's so real that, licking sugar out of the palm. Oh, that's so rich. We have something my students always ask me, and I never know how to answer, so I thought I would pass the buck to you guys. Is they always ask me how do you write good dialogue? How do you write realistic dialogue? Do you think about first of all, do you even think there is such a thing as realistic dialogue, and is this something that you think about? And Sarah, you can talk about all of your nonfiction books as well, because I'm really interested in that too, how you translate real people onto the page. What do you think?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, I should come clean and say that in an interview recently, I was talking about a conversation I had with another novelist friend, my friend Ed Park. And I said that I just got notes from a reader early on when I was writing Very Cold People, who said, this is just one character thinking. Like, what you really should do is have scenes and dialogue. And Ed texted back to me, dialogue is embarrassing. Oh, no, he said, I find dialogue embarrassing. And that just was so comforting to me. And then of course they used that as like the title of the piece that they wrote about this interview with me. So I have gone on the record already to say that I find dialogue embarrassing. And I do. I think there's dialogue in Very Cold People, but there isn't much.
There is,
yeah. There isn't much. This is a really cursory answer. I'm sure Antoine and Yiyun have more considered ones, but I just use dialogue that's memorable, like a good line. I'm not really one who I haven't really found it necessary to kind of represent a realistic extended conversation in fiction or nonfiction before. I really just sort of, use the good lines, like, I don't know, a poet.
Mm.
Yeah, one of my favorite teaching tools when it comes to dialogue is just a couple pages of Andy Warhol's novel A Novel, because it was just 48 hours or something of just various people in the factory transcribing a recording of Andy and company walking around, and it's just gobbledygook because real speech is not dialogue, and so that's just one little reminder to students. You can also send them out to record something like that and write up a transcript and recognize that it's an artificial construction. And then there's a sort of slider, right? Like some people want to have dialogue, he said, she said, all the way through, and other people prefer to just pick out like those best lines. And I feel like early on I was educated in that sort of more he said, she said, and came to realize as I read more and wrote more, that you can just use a little line or two. And then I love indirect dialogue, where you're sort of summarizing what the person is saying to give a scene a little more weight, so it doesn't feel like just talking heads in space.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just use Sarah's quote from now on. Dialogues are embarrassing. I find dialogues.
It's Ed Park, so don't credit me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Ed Park.
Ed Park.
Yes.
I'll credit Ed Park. I find dialogue very boring. I also find writing dialogue boring because it's for the exact reason, what Antoine said. I have actually done this. I send my students out to record people's dialogues in real life setting, and it's just very boring transcript. And the writers who write dialogues, I really love. One of them is, the British writer Ivy Compton Burnett. I don't know if you read her. 3-year-old saying very philosophical things, more articulate than I am in their dialogues. But I think there's a point about, I don't think dialogues are, as a realistic setting or, frame, I don't think they capture characters. I think I'm interested in the dialogues and what people would have said if they can articulate themselves, but people mostly don't articulate themselves. So I think Abby Compton Burnett and some other writers, Harry Green, for instance, they really take that to, these people are characters really are articulating themselves in a very eerie, unnatural way, but they're interesting. So that's where I stand with dialogue. I usually don't write long dialogues. I get bored with myself.
Along those lines, I enjoy reading Haruki Murakami's dialogue, which I often find preposterous and yet completely enjoyable and interesting. These characters will just, so, what do you think about life? And they'll just chat away like a couple of stoned freshmen on the roof. But it's great. So sometimes, it doesn't really matter as long as it works.
Yeah.
I feel attacked. I still speak that way.
Well, that brings us to our time. I want to thank all of you for this great conversation. So thank you, Antoine Wilson, Yiyun Li, and Sarah Manguso. Everyone, please remember you can order books in the link below, and please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which this year is celebrating its 17th year. Wow, I can't believe that. 17th year of presenting free literary programming, because I remember the first one. We're getting older. And a reminder that if you're in New York City next week, the in-person festival takes place on October 2nd in downtown Brooklyn. Thank you, everyone.